I appreciate that very much. As you know, as you all know, the preamble of the U.S. Constitution calls for a government that can provide for the common defense. It asks for its public officials to protect us against all enemies. Dr. David Barrett has spent his professional life thinking about what will make us safe. He has taught a class on national security for over 15 years. He's just published a book on the CIA and Congress showing that he's not only concerned with what makes us secure, but what will secure the Constitution and all of our rights as well. That book was extensively reviewed in the Washington Post just recently. It was called A Triumph of Research. It's won the D.B. Hartman Prize given by the Lyndon Baines Johnson Foundation, and it has been highly reviewed in any number of other publications. In addition to that, Dr. Barrett has published Lyndon B. Johnson's Vietnam Papers, a documentary collection, and he has published a book on certain warriors, Lyndon Johnson and his Vietnam advisors, and a host of other books, book chapters, and articles on questions of national security and answering the question of what we're all concerned with and what he's going to be addressing tonight, which is this date 6 years after 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the pressing question is, are we safer? So thank you, Dr. Barrett, and thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this evening of September 11th. Before I get into the heart of the talk, which of course is a very serious subject matter, I have to tell you something very practical and not very serious, which is, here's what it's like to reach middle age, as I've done in recent years. I got new eyeglasses a week ago, and I brought my notes in here this evening, and if you see me going like this, I haven't been drinking. It's because with these new glasses, I'm having to sort of navigate these different portions of the glasses. Thank you again for coming. I told students in my undergraduate national security policy course yesterday that many so-called experts have been speaking to this question about, are we safer now? And I said I advisedly use that word so-called. And I applied the word so-called to myself as well. And here's why. I think it's extremely difficult for us to know with anything approaching certainty the answer to this question, are we safer now? To really, really know if we are safer now, one would have to know not only the details of what changes, what reforms have been carried out effectively within the U.S. government, including many agencies which are highly secretive. Not only would we have to know that, we would have to know what is actually happening with terrorist groups around the world, especially Al-Qaeda, especially presumably some number of Al-Qaeda cells located not only in the Middle East, South Asia, but perhaps in portions of Europe and perhaps in areas within the United States. So the best that I think that we as citizens can do, and we as scholars, some of us as scholars can do, is to make what I hope are informed judgments on this question. When I did my work on the PhD level in graduate school, I'm happy to say I think I learned a few things in those years. And from international relation theorists, it sounds like a simple lesson, but for me it was actually pretty profound. One of the important things that I learned is that in an anarchic world, and when political scientists use the word anarchic to describe world politics, they're talking about the fact that there's no governing body for world politics. There's no world government, there's no agency that sort of runs the world. So we have a world of nation states, each nation more or less looking out for itself. And it's a dangerous world. In that sort of a world, information is imperfect. I repeat, information is imperfect. So the information that we might gather about conditions out and around the world is, it's flawed, it's imperfect. Misperceptions in this sort of the world are, at least much of the time, inevitable. It is just a sure bet that across a period of years, the U.S. government sometimes overestimates the hostile capabilities or intentions of others, and sometimes it will underestimate the hostile intentions and capabilities of others. So we're in a so-called anarchic world. Information is flawed. Misperceptions are a real possibility. So, the United States government spends approximately $45 billion per year on its intelligence agencies and on the activities that the intelligence agencies carry out. By the way, how do I know that number? This is supposed to be a classified secret, how much the U.S. government spends on intelligence activities. The reason I know is that the Deputy Director of National Intelligence was giving a speech to a group in Florida about a year ago, and she blurted out the figure, $45 billion. So there you go. That's what we spend, about $45 billion. It's a lot of money. It's far more money than any other nation spends on its intelligence activities. So despite having a huge intelligence establishment, despite a tremendous amount of spending, the fact remains that there are limits to what the U.S. government knows about the intentions and the capabilities of those out there who might harm us. Some of you may have studied intelligence, but most of you have not. It's a bit of a truism in the intelligence world that it's hard enough for a nation to know the capabilities of others. So that's hard enough to know. For us to know, for example, what are the specific military capabilities of the government of North Korea? That's hard enough to know. Harder still to know their intentions, their plans. So intelligence agencies for the U.S. and for other countries focus on that. I would say a central mission of the U.S. intelligence agencies, and it is a collection of agencies. It's not just CIA and NSA. It's over a dozen such agencies. But a central role of these agencies is to know about the intentions and the capabilities of those out there who might engage in surprise attack on the United States. Despite that spending, despite the existence of the CIA and the National Security Agency and the others, I repeat, there are limits to what we can know. No director of Central Intelligence who has testified on Capitol Hill or has spoken to presidents has ever denied this. There are limits to what we can know. It would have been foolhardy for such an intelligence director to deny this to a president or to a congressional committee. There are limits to what we know. Nonetheless, and the reason that I raise this, if you want to get at some kind of a credible answer to the question, are we safer now? A good starting point is the National Intelligence Estimate created by our intelligence establishment in July, just a couple of months ago. So I repeat, a National Intelligence Estimate, an NIE. An NIE is the most authoritative statement of our intelligence agencies about a particular problem or concern. So periodically, our intelligence establishment has been raising the question, to what extent are we in danger? How much are we at danger here at home from another major terrorist attack? So this National Intelligence Estimate was issued in July. It used the word assessments and judgments. The interesting thing about this NIE is that it takes us back to what I said about information being flawed, misperceptions perhaps happening. It says that the estimate assessed and judged various things about threats to the U.S., but it admits in an explanation right there in the estimate. Here's the quote. These assessments, which are based on incomplete or at times fragmentary information, are not a fact, not proof, not necessarily knowledge. So the admission is right there in the estimate, in the National Intelligence Estimate, that, we're assessing this, we're making judgments about this as best we can, but it's based on incomplete or sometimes fragmentary information, not always statements of fact, proof, or knowledge. Now, some might be scandalized by this admission by our intelligence agencies. I'm not. I think they're being honest. I think they're being realistic. Having said all that, the July National Intelligence Estimate is a good start for us to have some sense of an answer to this question, are we safer now? So here, I'm going to read you a few sample quotations. increased worldwide counterterrorism efforts, it's talking about the U.S. and its allies, over the past 5 years have constrained the ability of al-Qaeda to attack the U.S. homeland again, and have led terrorist groups to perceive the U.S., the homeland, as a harder target to strike than on September 11, 2001. These measures, again, measures by the U.S. government and intelligence allies, these measures have helped disrupt known plots against the U.S. since September 11th. So this is a key claim by our intelligence establishment. First of all, a starting point is that al-Qaeda is the #1 danger for the U.S. out there. Our counterterrorism efforts, they claim, along with allies, have helped to disrupt known plots against the U.S. and have made the U.S. a harder target to attack. Okay, but what else is there? Again, quoting, al-Qaeda is and will remain the most serious terrorist threat to the homeland. Its central leadership continues to plan high-impact plots. I'm still quoting. The group, al-Qaeda, has protected or regenerated key elements of its homeland attack capability, including a safe haven in the Pakistan federally administrated tribal areas, that area of a portion of Pakistan close to Afghanistan that is not really governed by the government of Pakistan. Also, operational lieutenants continue to be chosen, and its top leadership has regenerated. This is al-Qaeda's top leadership. The estimate says that U.S. intelligence has found few persons in the U.S. with ties to senior al-Qaeda leaders, but it judges that al-Qaeda will intensify its efforts to put operatives here within the U.S. A summary statement from this estimate is this: we judge that the United States currently is in a heightened threat environment. Plotting is likely to continue to focus on prominent political, economic, and infrastructure targets with the goal of producing mass casualties, visually dramatic destruction, significant economic aftershocks, and/or fear among the U.S. population. In other words, another September 11th. That last sentence is mine. In other words, another September 11th. And then a final quote. I'll go back for one more quote from this estimate. We assess that al-Qaeda will continue to try to acquire and employ chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear materials in attacks, and would not hesitate to use them if it develops what it deems a sufficient capability to do so. Well, this estimate, by the way, or the relevant, let's put it this way, significant portions of this estimate were made available to the public. You can read the whole thing. It's only about 3 pages. The larger document remains classified, available only to the President, his top advisors, and certain key members of Congress. But the essence of the estimate is, as I've stated it to you, and you can easily find it online. So, as I say, I think it's scary reading, but I take it seriously. Why do I take it seriously? The CIA and the rest of the U.S. intelligence establishment have a very mixed reputation with the United States public. The public is aware of intelligence failures that help contribute to the way that we went to war in Iraq. The public may be aware of abuses by the CIA and certain other intelligence agencies in prior decades when those agencies intervene in domestic political affairs. So I would say there is limited confidence on the part of the public in the intelligence agencies. Maybe most specifically, Americans heard the slam dunk story that when President Bush was apparently wondering about the case that could be made in the lead up to the war in Iraq, the case that could be made about Saddam having weapons of mass destruction, and the director of Central Intelligence at the time, George Tenet, allegedly said, "Mr. President, it's a slam dunk." Well, my view is, obviously, Tenet said something like that. My view, that's the sort of statement that a director of Central Intelligence should never make, to start talking about slam dunks, especially to a president who seems inclined to go to war. But the fact is, one leader does not constitute the entirety of the U.S. intelligence establishment. I believe that the intelligence agency, for the most part, is made up of very serious, capable, hardworking, patriotic people. I know I won't go into the details, but the creation of a national intelligence estimate is a very involved affair. And it matters a lot, because Congress, and at least many in the public, will want to have some faith that the intelligence agencies are being honest in sort of stating things as they see them, not just to the President and Congress, but even to a certain extent to the public. Let me just tell you very briefly that the way that we organize our intelligence establishment has changed in recent years. It used to be that the director of the CIA had a title called Director of Central Intelligence. He was supposed to run CIA and somehow still coordinate the whole intelligence establishment. It never worked well. That is, that so-called DCI might have been able to run CIA effectively, maybe, but no DCI was really able to coordinate the whole intelligence establishment, all these different agencies which are themselves part of other government departments. So Congress and President Bush created a new position called DNI, Director of National Intelligence, a few years ago. A man named Mike McConnell. He used to run the National Security Agency, which does signals intelligence. Meanwhile, CIA's director, a man named Mike Hayden, I don't want to go into length about these men, but I view them as serious, patriotic, smart, capable. So I have some real faith in them, and that they presided over, especially Mike McConnell, the DNI, whose job it would have been, presided over an honest process to produce this estimate. So the bottom line for this estimate seems to be that certain efforts of the U.S. government and allies have made the U.S. a harder target to attack successfully. But the world political environment, and especially the political environment in parts of the Middle East, perhaps parts of South Asia, parts of Europe, have become more threatening in recent years. Threat number one is al-Qaeda, of which Osama bin Laden is still the leader, symbolically at least, if perhaps not operationally. So that's my first point regarding, I think the National Intelligence Estimate tells us something. But to a second point, there are other voices in the executive branch. President Bush's Homeland Security Advisor, Francis Townsend, said on television a couple of times, just in the last week or so, Osama bin Laden is virtually impotent. Virtually impotent. So it's almost as if she was taunting bin Laden. The president himself, he has made remarks about al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is sometimes known as al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, that makes it sound as if that al-Qaeda is the same as the al-Qaeda that did the September 11th attacks. Here's a quote from President Bush. The same folks that are bombing innocent people in Iraq were the ones who attacked us on September 11th. Well, I would say that seems to be a part of a continuing effort to persuade a deeply skeptical American public that the war in Iraq is the central front in a war on terror which protects the U.S. homeland. While what we do in Iraq in the coming months and few years is a very consequential matter, for what it's worth, I have never believed that Iraq was the central front in any struggle of the U.S. to defend itself from terrorist attacks here at home. I won't go on a great length about that, but you see an important way in which I disagree with what the president has been saying lately. Let me move to a third point. Billions of dollars have been spent in recent years, since September 11th, on what is called Homeland Security, on the Homeland Security Department, this new department of government that was created, and by other agencies. But, as I think you know, there have been innumerable news reports, some congressional reports and studies, other government reports showing that many of those billions of dollars have been wasted. There have, for example, been recurring news stories, newspapers, magazines, television, on security lapses, security breakdowns at airports and at our coastal ports. I have the sense the television reporters love to sort of do those things where they show how, boy, you know, all these things went through the so-called security perimeter and somehow it wasn't caught by the machines or the personnel. I have to say, for myself, I had something of an experience of security lapses at airports. I was at O'Hare Airport a few weeks ago, and you know, if you're traveling these days, you can only take a very limited amount, these small containers of liquids, and it has to be in a plastic bag and all that. And the man ahead of me didn't have the plastic, had big containers of liquids, and he said, oh well, he didn't know, or he assumed that, you know, somehow the personnel would put these things in a package for him, and at first, he was told firmly, you know, you can't take these, you can mail them, you can throw them away, but you can't take them through. And he just sort of said, well, I didn't really know and I didn't really understand. And to my amazement, they said, well, okay, we'll let you go through. So much for, I hope that's a rare sort of an instance, but they let him go through. I hope that's not representative. Okay. I haven't personally researched port security. I haven't personally researched the security perimeters and airports and all that. The public was led to believe in 2002 by the Congress and the President that when the Department of Homeland Security was created, that this would make a huge difference in our security here at home. I think it's fair to say that very few people today believe that that is true. Maybe someday the Homeland Security Department will work effectively. Few people think it works effectively yet. Just think about FEMA and Katrina a couple of years ago, FEMA being part of that Homeland Security Department. So, it's my hope, I don't say it is a well-researched belief, it is my hope that some of those billions of dollars have improved security at our ports and at our airports. A fourth point, the President, to a certain extent, that national intelligence estimate, and even political figures on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton's an example, have suggested we are safer now. Hillary Clinton is quite clear to say that we are safer now. The President says that. Others, many others say that. Now, part of the evidence for that is that there has not been a major terrorist attack here at home in these past 6 years. I don't think that can be ignored. I think that is a credible, it is credible evidence that perhaps we are safer here at home, given the fact that there has not been such a major attack in these past years. By the way, though, here's how former Senator John Edwards responded to Hillary Clinton's statement. Quote, "Today we know two unequivocal truths about President Bush's approach. There are more terrorists and we have fewer allies." I have to say, I think it would be imprudent to doubt that there are more anti-U.S. terrorists out there today in the Middle East and elsewhere. Including perhaps in Europe, where many Muslims live in ghettos, cut off from the mainstream of society. So Hillary Clinton may have a point, but I think John Edwards has a point as well. Now, fifth, I want to turn to this sort of topic of what are sometimes called breeding grounds for terrorists or breeding grounds for terrorism. And there are a lot of different ways that that could be spoken about. I want to get at that topic just by way of public opinion in Muslim countries about the United States government. The question at hand is, when public opinion in Muslim countries is overwhelmingly anti-U.S. government, does that mean that those societies, those countries, are so-called breeding grounds for terrorism? And the way that I want to tell you about this, or address this with you, is to tell you about a study that I came across recently that was done by an institute at the University of Maryland. Earlier this year, and then I gather in the latter part of last year, they did scientific public opinion polling in 4 Muslim countries: Pakistan, Morocco, Egypt, and Indonesia. In addition to doing polling, they did so-called focus groups events where the pollsters would sit with groups of citizens from these countries and ask sort of open-ended questions. So here are some of the results. Now again, this is public opinion about the U.S. government in these 4 predominantly Muslim countries. 8 in 10 of those surveyed believe that the United States seeks to divide and weaken the Islamic world. That's roughly 80% believe the U.S. government seeks to divide and weaken the Islamic world. And there were big majorities agreeing to this claim in all 4 of these countries. 7 in 10 agree that America's goal is to weaken Islam as a religion so that it will not grow and challenge the Western way of life. Over 60% of those polled in these countries think that it's the U.S. government's goal to spread Christianity to that region. A general question asked of people in these countries is, well, how do you feel overall about the U.S. government? Huge majorities had an unfavorable view. In Morocco, 76% had an unfavorable view of the U.S. government. In Egypt, which we think of as an ally, the government at least, 93% of the public has an unfavorable view of our government. In Pakistan, 67% with a negative view. Indonesia, 66%. Overall, 74% of those in these countries want the U.S. to withdraw its military forces from all Islamic countries. 53% approve of attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq. 53%. In these same 4 countries, no more than 35% agree that Al-Qaeda did the September 11th attacks. They think someone else did it. They think the U.S. government staged it. They think Israel did it. They think someone did it, but not Al-Qaeda. Is there any good news? Oh, by the way, in terms of where do these negative views come from in the focus groups that were held, the people sort of being questioned in these focus groups, they said a lot about Abu Ghraib, a lot about Guantanamo. They said a lot about the fact that President Bush once, in a statement where I don't think he quite realized what he was saying at that moment, didn't intend the statement to sound as it did, but he used the word crusade. He said we're on a crusade to deal with these terrorist problems. Well, the word crusade has some very negative implications in the Muslim world. And a U.S. military leader has spoken more explicitly, and I think he did it purposefully, about how we are on a crusade. And this is much better known in the Muslim world than I think it is with the American public. Is there good news in this study of public opinion about the U.S. government in these 4 predominantly Muslim countries? There is some good news. Most Muslims in these countries admire democracy. They admire what we might call American ideals. Most think, this is interesting, that globalization, freer trade, freer communication, is a good thing. Only 30% view, well, maybe I shouldn't say only, for what it's worth, 30% of those polled view Osama bin Laden favorably. Most of those polled in this country, overwhelming majority, disapprove of terrorist attacks on civilian targets. 75% said such attacks on civilians are never justified under any circumstances. And even if it's done by Al-Qaeda. In Pakistan, there was resistance to the notion that Al-Qaeda is terroristic. Nonetheless, there's opposition to the idea of attacks on civilians. Okay, well, the man who did the study, Professor Stephen Schull at the University of Maryland, makes a point that I think is good. In light of the fact that there is such negative opinion of the U.S. government, does that mean that more terrorism will arise against the U.S. from this country? So he says, well, not necessarily, but anti-American feelings can lead Muslims to suppress their moral doubts about Al-Qaeda. And that makes it politically more difficult for the governments of those countries to take strong actions against Al-Qaeda. It makes publics more likely to passively accept Al-Qaeda, and it creates a larger pool of individuals who may cross over that threshold into actively supporting or even joining Al-Qaeda. In other words, he said Al-Qaeda gets more room to maneuver when public opinion is so substantially anti-U.S. government in those countries. I think he's right. I think the U.S. government needs to give due consideration to public opinion in the Muslim world. Of course, the U.S. government knows this. The State Department has begun an initiative in the last year or so to try to alter, in a more favorable way, public opinion of the U.S. in such countries. I'm going to come to my conclusion now. I think, I emphasize the word think, that the world has become a more dangerous place for the United States. I believe that there are more who would attack us if they can. I believe, based on the reading I've done, that the U.S. government has, on the whole, made us a harder target to hit effectively. I don't doubt that some intelligence efforts have paid off. For example, this controversial program carried out by the National Security Agency to monitor communications between persons here at home and persons abroad, the target being persons here who seemingly have some kind of link, and or the persons abroad being linked to possible terrorist groups. Why has that initiative of monitoring these kinds of communications between the U.S. and countries abroad, why has it been controversial? Well, let me just say as a starting point, I favor such monitoring of communications between persons in the U.S. and persons abroad if there's any reason to believe that the conversations may have something to do with attacks on the U.S. And it's clear to me, in terms of U.S. public opinion, that most of the American public feels that way as well. So why did this become such a controversy? President Bush, I suppose on the basis, or I don't know if it was because of what advisors told him or just his own initiative, but in any case, the Bush administration, going back a few years, decided to cut out the two intelligence committees of Congress from real knowledge of this monitoring program. For example, they brought in, they told like the chairman of each committee and then the ranking member, which would be the senior Democrat. So for example, the senior Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Rockefeller, they brought him into the White House or some such spot, and they told him that, well, we started using National Security Agency, which does signals intelligence. We're monitoring certain conversations between people here, people abroad. But they said to Rockefeller, you can't tell the committee, the rest of the Intelligence Committee, so the chairman knows and you know, and that's it. You can't take any notes about what we're telling you here today. You can't tell your staffers. You can't tell you can't tell anyone. You're being informed, and that's the end of it. That's not it's not what the law prescribes in terms of the role of these two intelligence committees. These two intelligence committees have had an excellent record at keeping secrets in the decades that they have existed. So the Bush administration essentially decided to cut the two committees out of any sort of real knowledge of this monitoring of such conversations. And maybe as crucially, maybe more crucially, there's a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Activities Court, FISA court, a court of special court with special judges to agree that when this monitoring is done, that it's appropriate that it be done. And the Bush administration decided, in essence, to cut that court out as well of this process. So cutting out the intelligence committees, cutting out the court, the Bush administration managed to carry on this way for a couple of years until the New York Times reported that this monitoring was going on and that it was being done in a way that was of only questionable legality. Well, there have been some compromises since then. The FISA court's involved again. The committees have a bit more knowledge. But anyway, I think this whole controversy was unnecessary. Surely in Washington, D.C., serious, patriotic, rational human beings, if there had been real discussions between the Bush administration, the intelligence committees, and the FISA court, surely they could have worked out ways to carry on the monitoring without simply cutting out the committees and the court. So really there was a controversy because of the way that the Bush administration wanted this to be done. It may be that the committees and the court can be blamed somewhat. I mainly blame the Bush administration for that failure and that controversy. It would be nice in our most crucial national security efforts if partisanship and bickering didn't come into it, and if people could sort of forget, which political party they're a member of, which branch of government even they're representing, and just think about trying to collaborate with persons from other branches and parties on matters of actual national security. Here's my closing comment. I came to Villanova in 1990. The Berlin Wall had just come down. The Soviet Union would cease to exist by the end of 1991. But I was hired to come to Villanova to teach a course. Mainly I was hired to teach a course called National Security Policy. There had been a practice in my department to teach 2 sections per semester. So, and I still teach this course, I like teaching. But anyway, the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. A couple of years passed, and one of my colleagues saying in a friendly way, but I think he was serious, he seemed to be serious. He said, well, what's really the point of teaching a national security course? I mean, there's no Cold War, there's no Soviet Union, there's no real communist threat. And I said, well, I think the world is still a dangerous place. I really do. So today, 6 years after the September 11th attacks, some people assert that it's significant that we have not been attacked again, that our government must be doing some things right. I agree with that statement. I still think the world is a dangerous place. Thank you. If you want to have some dialogue here, I'm happy to respond to any comments you want to make or any questions you want to raise. I'm happy to do that for 10 or 15 minutes if you would like. So it's up to you. Yes.
I wonder what you make of General Petraeus' comments today. He came before Congress and he was asked flat out if he thought America was safer as a result of our actions in Iraq. And his answer was, I simply don't know. So I know you've said in the past that it's not the job of military men or members of the intelligence community to formulate policy. So is that why he answered that way, do you believe, or is it a result of what you've been advocating today, that it's really not resulted from Iraq, or that Iraq is not a reason for Homeland Security?
Because I was preparing for this event this evening, and I also have a class this evening that we're going to have a brief meeting of after. I saw the headlines, so I didn't see that General Petraeus had made that comment. I think in a lot of ways it's a smart answer for him to make. Number one, the law requires that military leaders, when they're doing testimony on Capitol Hill, needless to say, the law requires that they speak honestly. So for him to say that he doesn't know if the war in Iraq has made Americans safer here at home, that's what he said, I don't know, right? I actually think he was being honest in saying that. As I understand General Petraeus, I mean, look, he's a military leader, his job, and he's our commander in Iraq. His job is to win that war. However you define win, that's his job. So for him to wade into this controversy about, the sort of the larger war on terrorism and this related but somewhat just different question, are we safer here at home? I think he was being shrewd and honest to just say, I don't know. It is fascinating that he said it, though. Yes.
As we're trying to guard ourselves from terrorism, meaning the actions of terrorists, isn't it frankly impossible to do that, to prevent it not just from Islamic fundamentalism, but from the Timothy McVeighs of the world? And where do we go from here? Do we just keep hiding our security as time goes on, or will it ever diminish into the future? I mean,
well, I think that I would hope that over the coming, I might say, decades, that our government, let's assume that our government has gotten at least somewhat smarter about how we sort of carry out security reforms in recent years. I hope that that's the case. I think there's some truth to that. I hope as well that the government will continue to learn and to become somewhat smarter about how we do these things. I mean, we've all read stories, and we all know of incidents where there are just some seemingly stupid things that have been done. But again, September 11th in a lot of ways was a surprise for us, and I think we've managed to become somewhat smarter. In the longer run, what our government does is going to be affected, I think, tremendously by that world political environment. If Al-Qaeda should somehow be diminished, or if the Middle East, South Asia becomes sort of a calmer place, less hostile to U.S. interests, then I think our security practice here at home will be reduced substantially. But that's not going to be any time soon. It does sort of remind me when I was a kid, as I became aware of politics and international politics, I learned that there was a kind of a widespread sense that the Cold War was just going to go on and on and on. It was hard to think about it ever ending. I don't have a sense of when this period of history that we're now in, where dealing with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist threats, I don't know when it's going to end. But it's not going to be next year or the year after next. It's going to go on for a long time. I'm sure of that much. Yes. Yes.
Dr. Barrett, what do you suppose would be the motivation for the President of the United States, the Bush administration, to bypass judicial review and congressional oversight, particularly on that last item?
Okay. Well, here's one part of, I think, an answer to that question. Vice President Cheney is extremely influential in the Bush administration. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people either jokingly or seriously claim like Cheney runs the administration and, Bush sort of defers to him. Nonsense. But the president has tremendous respect for Vice President Cheney and his opinions. I think there can be no doubt about that. Dick Cheney has been very clear for a long time about what he thinks of congressional oversight of intelligence. He has contempt for it. I'm not aware of what he has said about the FISA court, but I've seen many times going back when he, in fact, was in the Congress and in various points along the way in the executive branch, he has contempt for this notion of congressional monitoring of crucial intelligence activity. So I think that's part of an answer right there. The other thing is, I gather there was this widespread belief in the Bush administration that the procedures for the FISA court were simply taking too long. And my view is, well, if that's the case, and it may have been, then, reform this, have consultations with Congress to change the FISA court so that it acts quickly. Yes?
You mentioned the scientific polling before and the opinion of America within Muslim areas.
Yes, 4 countries, yes.
4 countries. I was wondering, I have 2 questions. I was wondering, do we know what exactly, if it was male, female, do we know?
Yes, this institute at the University of Maryland has issued a report, and this Professor Krull, K-R-U-L-L, I think, has testified on Capitol Hill, and both his testimony and the report itself, which has those kind of details about how the polling was done, is available online. And if you want to send me an email, I could send you a link. And you have another question as well?
Do you think that maybe the opinion of America broadcasted by those studies were affected by the gender? Because definitely American ideals would mean something totally different to a Muslim male than to a Muslim female.
Yes, I recall that the pollsters tried to take that into account, the way that they carried it out. I think that's a good question, and I read his testimony, which only sort of skimmed the surface of a detailed answer to that, but my recollection is that in the report they do treat that in some detail. Yeah. Yes?
Could you also say that in some sense the failure that we have has been in some sense contributed to the logistical and tactical failures the administration has gone through in these years, along with our relations with Israel?
Actually, if you could restate the question, I didn't quite catch what your question was.
Would you say that some of the reason we're not as safe in the world is because of our logistical and tactical failures the administration has gone through in governing the war and our relations with Israel?
Well, it seems pretty clear there have been some real failures. I don't want to exaggerate them, but it seems clear that there have been some real failures in terms of the way that we've carried out the war in Afghanistan. There are real questions about whether our military effort in Afghanistan was detrimentally affected by our shifting to get ready for the war in Iraq. Reasonable people disagree on the answer to that question. I think the answer is yes, that our effort in Afghanistan has been harmed by our trying to then do this second war in Iraq. And it seems pretty clear there were a variety of failures militarily, in terms of even just policing, Iraq and the immediate aftermath of the overthrow of Saddam's government. So I think there can be no doubt that those kinds of failures have harmed both the possibility of success in Iraq and have harmed our success in Afghanistan, and that in turn, because the Al-Qaeda operatives are substantially, if they're not in Afghanistan, they're in Pakistan, close to the Afghanistan border, and our failures there have real implications for our security here. So I think the short answer to your question is yes. You mentioned Israel, which is a difficult topic. This matter of Israel was also asked about in the polling, and the widespread sense in the Muslim world is that the U.S. doesn't have a balanced policy, that it favors the Israelis far more over the Palestinians. One interesting footnote to that, those polled, and again the polling was done in the last year or so, they love Bill Clinton. He is this overwhelmingly popular figure with the public in these four countries. They perceive, and I was trying to think, now why is that? And you could start talking about Clinton himself and all this alleged charm or whatever, charisma. But I thought, well, there are all these pictures of Clinton with Arafat and Rabin, the prime minister of Israel. And I thought, well, sometimes an image, a picture has a tremendous impact on public opinion. But relations with Israel, to say the least, are a complicating factor in our relations with the Arab world. Yeah. Yes. And then I'll go back there.
You stated that the terrorist attack in the U.S. Syria in 6 years. To your knowledge, anyone speculated that one of the reasons why is that it's simply more cost-effective, or for lack of a better word, for Al-Qaeda to strike at U.S. interest overseas, specifically in Iraq, where we are probably a lot more exposed. Our national securities are a lot more exposed than they would be, say, on U.S. soil.
Well, I'll tell you what I think, and again, reasonable people. There are smart people out there on both sides of this question. The estimate says, and I agree, they want to hit the U.S., the homeland. Al-Qaeda want this. Target number one is here at home for Al-Qaeda. I think that that's true. There's no doubt that Al-Qaeda in Iraq does wage some, commit some, provoke some damage against the U.S. military and others. But for Al-Qaeda and what we normally think of as Al-Qaeda, and headed by bin Laden, the other people, I think this is still the number one target. And I think it is significant that we've managed to go 6 years without another major attack. It's interesting to me that the estimate uses fairly dramatic language. It talks about, almost it makes you think of sort of the television pictures that we saw on September 11th. I really think this national intelligence estimate is trying to be about as dramatic. The people who wrote it are being about as dramatic as these analysts ever get when they talked about the kind of attack that Al-Qaeda wants to carry out here at home. Something dramatic that will frighten public opinion, it'll kill a lot of people, produce these vivid pictures. I think that they're right, that that's what Al-Qaeda wants to do. And I do think it's significant that, thank God it hasn't happened for the past 6 years. I said I'd go back there first and then I'll come over. Yes.
There's a lot of focus on, and as it should be, on Iraq and Afghanistan in the media and our society. But how much attention is the U.S. government paying to other big factors such as Iran and relations with them?
Well, I mean, the U.S. government is paying a lot of attention to Iran. There are, as best as I can see, there are real differences of opinion even within the Bush administration about how we should best relate to Iran, how we should make judgments about Iran's involvement in this current Iraq war. And there are also sort of differences between many in the Bush administration and Capitol Hill about how we should relate to Iran. And I find even that the Democrats, at least, and perhaps the Republicans as well, running for president right now, are having some debates about, what do we do about Iran? So yes, I think Iran is very much a focus of attention by this administration and others. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Regarding the perception of another large-scale attack, such as 9/11, some people have said that it's no longer possible given their infrastructure deficiency. Some have said that it's imminent. Based on your research, what is your opinion regarding the possibility of another large 9/11-esque catastrophe?
Well, honestly, I think it is a real possibility. I do believe, I stressed at the end of my formal remarks, I do believe that our government has succeeded in making it harder for others to commit such attacks. I think that Al-Qaeda is still a significant organization, significant in the sense of capabilities. Look, there are plenty of people, at least in the academic world, and some in the world of government and politics. But you know, I'm aware of a book by a scholar that I have respected for years. John Mueller wrote a book called War, Presidents, and Public Opinion, which I thought was a terrific book. But he issued a book a couple of years ago that basically said Al-Qaeda's not a threat anymore. Now, he's a very smart man, but you know what? I just think he's wrong to say that Al-Qaeda is basically defeated and insignificant. I think that the estimate is correct. The national intelligence estimate is correct, which is to say that Al-Qaeda is stronger in the last couple of years than it was further back, and is aiming to hit us again. I think that that's a correct judgment that they have made. Yes?
In regards to Iraq, the Bush administration has repeatedly said that if we don't fight them there, we'll have to fight them at home. Yet numerous independent investigations have refuted this argument. What are your thoughts on this topic? Are insurgents and even foreign fighters in Iraq a threat or a domestic threat to U.S. citizens?
Well, honestly, I think that statement, and I've heard it many times from, I hate to say this, but many times from the President and others' administration, when the statement being, we have to fight them there so that they don't hit us here at home. But who's the them? Again, you know, at the point where we went into this war in Iraq, there was still a majority of American, U.S. public opinion that believed that Saddam Hussein was in some very big way responsible for the September 11th attack. Now that was incorrect, but to me there's no mystery as to why the public was confused at that point. It's because there was these very, what I regarded as sly statements by figures, including leading figures in the Bush administration, who, without overtly lying, gave that impression to the American public. And I think that's why a majority of the public was in favor of getting into this war, because they had been, in my view, substantially misled. So this question of who's there in Iraq, I don't doubt that there are some insurgents who, let's say whenever the Iraq war concludes, for better or worse, I don't doubt that there are some who would like then to come here and wage some attack. But I do not believe that that's characteristic of the people that we are fighting there. I think, again, reasonable people who I suppose disagree about this, I think there's some version of a civil war going on there. I hope that we can militarily and politically achieve success in bringing that to an end in the coming years. So I'm not optimistic, but this notion that we have to fight them in Iraq so that they don't attack us here, I think misleads the American public. Look, most Americans don't follow the details of government and politics and policymaking on a daily basis. I mean, that's a fact. I don't say that with any kind of disrespect or contempt. I have family members who say to me, "Oh, I don't like politics. I don't read the newspaper. I don't watch the news. I don't want to think about that stuff." Well, okay. But in fact, many Americans feel that way. And I think, but those are the people who are most susceptible to being misled back in, 2002 and 3, and being misled today. One last question, yes.
The U.S. government puts a lot of focus on threats from the Middle East and from highly Muslim concentrated areas. Do you feel that the awareness of threat from other regions has waned, such as the threat from North Korea or possibly from Venezuela with Hugo Chavez?
Well, I mean, I think there are plenty of people in the State Department, the Defense Department, whose job it is to think about possible dangers to the U.S. from those other corners of the world. Certainly, there's a good, even if there's not much publicity, there's a good deal of attention on the part of the Defense Department, the State Department, and I don't doubt on the part of President Bush himself regarding the dangers of North Korea. Because the leader of North Korea gives a lot of evidence of being unstable, possibly irrational, and there's this, we're not entirely sure about their capabilities in terms of nuclear warheads and the programs that they've come up with along those ways. So there is focus in major portions of the government about these other areas of the world, and I hope it's not a naive faith, but I have some faith that, you know, they are thinking in appropriate ways about, you know, what needs to be done, whether it's Venezuela or North Korea. Well, I will stop on that note, and thank you very much.